There have been several studies published that have looked at antibody development in people who have recovered from a COVID-19 infection. Studies report between 90 and 95% of people have detectable antibodies after infection, leaving 5 to 10% of people without detectable antibodies. One of these studies was particularly interesting. They looked at 829 people who recovered from COVID and found that 87 of them didn't have detectable antibodies. They followed all of these people for 4 months after their first infection, and in the group without antibodies, 25 of them had a second COVID-19 infection. This is compared to only 1 person out of the group with antibodies. This tells us that you definitely want antibodies to protect you from a second infection. And for 5 to 10% of people who recovered from COVID-19, they don't have detectable antibody levels. The other unknown is how long antibodies and general immunity lasts after a natural infection. We're still learning the science about COVID-19 infection, but at this point, from what we know so far, it looks like most, but not all, people who've had an infection probably have protective immunity for at least 3 months after the infection, and perhaps longer. What we haven't discussed is what about the participants with baseline positive antibodies who got randomized to the placebo group, and so they didn't get the vaccine. In the placebo group, there were over 600 people with baseline antibodies and over 19,000 without baseline antibodies. Since none of these people got the real vaccine, we would expect a lower rate of COVID infection among those with antibodies, right? Over the course of the study, 259 participants in the group that didn't have antibodies ended up with a symptomatic COVID infection, and 9 in the portion of the placebo group with baseline antibodies ended up with a symptomatic COVID infection. When we look at what percent this is, it's identical. 1.3% of those without antibodies and 1.3% of those with antibodies in the placebo group contracted symptomatic COVID. Remember, these would have been people with mild or asymptomatic COVID who didn't even know they already had it. So this shows that a prior mild or asymptomatic infection, even with antibodies, might not be protective against a second infection. Moderna did an interesting study and looked at antibody levels of vaccinated participants in their clinical trials at 90 days after dose 2 and compared them to 41 controls who had not been vaccinated but had recovered from COVID. They found that the vaccinated group had significantly more antibodies. So to wrap all this up, studies have found that there's lots of individual variation in how much you're protected after a COVID infection. Trials have found that there's no increased safety risk to getting the vaccine if you've already had an infection, and science supports a potential benefit of building a better immune response if you get vaccinated. Based on all this, the CDC and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices both recommend that you should be offered a COVID-19 vaccine regardless of if you had a previous infection or not. They do recommend that you not be vaccinated during an acute COVID infection and that you wait until you've recovered and finished your isolation period. Additionally, if you received monoclonal antibodies or convalescent plasma as part of your COVID treatment, it's recommended that you wait at least 90 days before vaccination.